Thank you. Okay, so welcome to our very international audience today of both language educators and human rights educators. I'm Audrey Osler, and I am co-chair of the WERA International Research Network on Human Rights Education with Hugh Starkey, and also editor-in-chief of Human Rights Education Review. This webinar is run by the WERA International Research Network on Human Rights Education and HRER Human Rights Education Review, our scholarly journal. It's also sponsored by the International Association for Human Rights Education. And I'd like to alert you at the beginning of the seminar to our upcoming conference, which will be held in London on the 19th of April. And we invite you to consider coming to our conference. You're very welcome to come to our conference. We have a call for papers out, and the deadline for that call for papers is the 7th of December, so in a few weeks' time. And you can find the details of that call on the platform of Human Rights Education Review. We're particularly pleased this evening to welcome two of our guest editors of Human Rights Education Review, Melina Porto from La Plata University, Argentina, and Tony Berner from the University of Southeastern Norway. So I think that special edition of Human Rights Education Review, which is going to be on human rights education and language learning, will be particularly interesting to you all and should be published in January next year. So those are my general introductions. I'd now like to welcome Ricardo Romhild, and we're very, very pleased to have you with us this evening, Ricardo. And I'd just like to say a brief few words about him before Ricardo starts to speak. He's going to be talking for about 25 minutes, and then we will be having discussion through to the end of this webinar. So Ricardo is an educator and researcher at the Chair for English Language Education at the University of Münster, Germany. He's worked in the field of teacher education since 2018. Excuse me. Previous to that, he was a Fulbright teaching assistant in the United States, and also he's worked as a teacher of English as a foreign language, of geography, and of German as a second language in Germany. And perhaps not surprising for our seminar this evening, his scholarly work primarily revolves around global citizenship and sustainability in language education. But I know he also has interest in global Englishes. As well as being active in our human rights education community, he's also active in the Elinet network and the Angel network. So he's a person to know and be in touch with. Ricardo defended his PhD at the University of Münster in December 2022, and he's got two new books coming out, which I know he's going to refer to. The first is Global Citizenship, Eco-Media and English Language Education, which is going to be published in January 2022. And Ricardo is also co-editor of what looks to be a very, very interesting collection of articles in a book entitled Rethinking Cultural Learning, Cosmopolitan Perspectives on Language Education, which is going to be published in the coming days by the German publisher WVT. So welcome, Ricardo, to this seminar. Look forward to hearing you and to hearing what you have to say on this very, very pertinent topic. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Audrey. And thank you, everyone, for being here and for giving me the opportunity to speak about human rights perspectives in language education for sustainable development, and my article that was published very kindly with Human Rights Education Review on hope for language pedagogies. There is a running gag at the Chair of English Language Education in Münster, where I work, because I'm on record saying that hope is unscientific. There's, of course, some context to this. I was reviewing a colleague's paper, and in their conclusion, they ended on a hopeful note, saying that things might change for the better in their area of research. But I'm afraid, context or no context, the harsh truth is that I said that. And at the time, I meant it. So today, I'm going to tell you the story of how I came from saying this to writing a paper on hope for language pedagogy, in which I explore how human rights informed language education may help learners engage with the climate crisis and other sustainability-related issues in a hopeful, action-oriented way. And in doing so, I will share some of the things I've learned by engaging with ideas of pedagogies of hope. First, I'm going to provide you with some context on my work and the idea of a language education for sustainable development, which is fundamental to what I do. Then I turn to the focal term of this piece, hope, distinguishing different kinds of hope from wishful thinking to forward dream to concrete action. And it is here that the idea of learner agency is emphasized as central to hopeful pedagogy. Then I turn to human rights education, which is already an integral part of language education for sustainable development. But here I use the idea of a human rights education as pedagogy of hope, following Audrey and Christian Stocky here, to further substantiating this idea. Up to that point, it's going to be rather philosophical. And I would argue that we also need that kind of research in education to drive us forward. But the final section discusses concrete implications for the language classroom in the context of languages of hope and advocacy. And here we can see how hopeful language pedagogy, informed by principles of human rights education, may turn the language classroom into a space of hope to help learners envision a better future and to take communicative actions to realize these futures. We start with one of the most influential current philosophers. Certainly, for me, that is the case, Bayo Akomolafe. In an address he gave on the question whether there is a solution to the climate crisis, he dared his audience to ask this question: what if the way we think about and respond to the crisis is part of the crisis? So this prompted me as a language educator to ask, and what if the way we teach and learn to speak about the crisis is part of the crisis? And there are two lines of thought opening up here for me in which we can approach this question. The first one has to do with an inverted question. In language education, at least in Germany, oftentimes we find that the environment and sustainability are topics, often in year 10 or above, in a curriculum filled with a host of other topics. So the question asked there is, what can sustainability as a topic, what can global citizenship do for the language classroom? But I want to flip this question and also ask what contribution the languages can make to the project of education for sustainable development, human rights, and global citizenship. And that is the idea behind the term language education for sustainable development, to better reflect this kind of give and take relationship. And there's a host of literature available on this topic as well, where we can observe a shift towards this realization. These are just a few from the German context, but internationally, there's a lot of movement in the field as well. In Germany, we have Lütke Merzer-Rauschert, who edited a volume exploring global citizenship education and language education. We also have Carola Surkamp's edited volume on education for sustainable development in the English language classroom, which includes chapters reporting from praxis. And I'm really happy to share that my own book is due to be published in January 2024, Global Citizenship, Eco-Media, and English Language Education. So if we ask if the way we speak about the crisis is part of the crisis, then perhaps part of an answer lies in the fact that the conversations are indeed shifting towards taking a more holistic approach to education for sustainable development in the languages. And there's a second way to approach this question. My observation from textbooks and my own experience as an educator tells me that we learn to speak about the crisis in terms of languages of fear, of despair, and of catastrophe, not only at schools, but also in our everyday lives. For instance, a common experience at teacher education workshops for me is that teachers there don't want to talk about sustainability because it's just another doom and gloom topic, next to pandemic, next to war, and the like. So maybe we need to find alternative ways of talking about the crisis, hopeful ways. And at this point, I really need and want to stress that my work does not aim to open dichotomies between hopeful and not so hopeful pedagogies. It is important to acknowledge that pedagogies of discomfort, for example, are being discussed. We have Melina Porter here today, which I'm very excited about. And I would also subscribe to the idea that there is a time and place for this type of pedagogy and that it can be very powerful. But I would also argue that we should never stop there, because pedagogies of discomfort, as Melina put it in this, I think, outstanding paper on pedagogies of discomfort in language ed, or pedagogies of fear, as Stuart Tannock puts it, or even pedagogy of experience of crisis, or as experiences of crisis, as Helene Decker-Cornell and Currents say, I think should only be a stepping stone towards pedagogy, which doesn't leave students with a sinking feeling in their guts, but much rather with strategies to deal with anxiety, with anger, with despair, and crucially, a host of alternatives to giving up. In other words, a pedagogy which helps learners explore visions of hope for a better future. And here too, we find literature which helps us contour what hopeful language education in the context of sustainability and global citizenship might look like. Among other works, of course, Freire's and Bell Hook's Pedagogies of Hope. And very, very current, Doug Bourne and Massimiliano Tarozzi's Pedagogy of Hope for Global Social Justice, which is due to be published tomorrow, actually. It's exciting times for hopeful education. But what do we actually mean when we say hope? Upon first talking about hopeful language pedagogy, I was, and I still am, written off as an idealist with a cheesy outlook on life and education. And perhaps I am a little idealistic, and I certainly am an optimist, but maybe that explains why I work in education in the first place. And maybe a little bit of positivity is needed to set out to explore pedagogies of hope. So while this certainly to some extent has to do with mindsets, research into hope in fields such as, from fields such as psychology, sociology, and philosophy tells us that there's much more to it. For example, we can distinguish between passive hope and radical or critical hope. Passive hope is a kind of wishful thinking, an idea that things will turn out okay, even if I don't do anything towards this. On the opposite, we have critical or radical hope, which is based in the status quo, no matter what that status quo looks like. It's based in critique of the status quo to identify and concrete steps to move beyond that status quo. Oyala calls this pathway thinking towards a future which is not yet, in a beautiful phrase, as I think. And we can see this reflected not only in the fact that there are so many new books on why hope matters. For example, we have Not Too Late, which is a compelling compilation of short essays that I really highly recommend. Or we have Hope Matters, an inspiring book arguing that evidence-based hope is our most powerful tool for transformation. And we also have Corinne Pelluchon, L'Espérance ou la traversée de l'impossible, which is a philosophical essay arguing that the vulnerability of society and the possibility of social collapse offers opportunities for change and generates hope. But we can also see this in other scholarly approaches to why hope matters. My personal favorite one is the one that I also explored in my work, and that has to do with Horkheimer and Adorno's concept of disappointed hope, which I then connect to Beck's idea of risk society. I first encountered the concept of disappointed hope when Homi Bhabha used it during a keynote speech at Ruhr Triennale 2019, and I was very lucky to sit in the audience that night. Talking about the migrant crisis, certainly one of the more prominent human rights issues in the early 21st century, Bhabha asked his audience and society as a whole, really, to put themselves in a proleptical position, a position where we jump forward and then look at where we are today, and to identify injustices and human rights issues and identify what we need to help ourselves now. Oyala would refer to this as pathway thinking towards a future which is not yet. And Bhabha argues that dealing with global injustices and human rights issues needs to be motivated by a shared sense of responsibility, which goes far beyond the feeling of empathy and solidarity. It's really responsibility. We look at the now, the status quo, the disappointed, and we see which things are going badly. And then Bhabha reminds us that we need to understand what we may call the rationality of risk. Risk not simply as the last act of desperation, but as a kind of disappointed hope. And then we can connect this to Beck's risk theory or risk society, because Beck explains that risk as the anticipation of catastrophe also exists to develop new utopias and hope. In other words, precisely because the risk society is all about the anticipation and the avoidance of catastrophe, it is also a hope society. It is about exploring ways to circumvent catastrophe, to create alternative futures. Put differently still, from disappointment, a place of fear, of despair, of failure, of crisis, of continuing risk, emerges hope, philosophically speaking. And this all boils down to one thing in the educational context: agency. Because there's a clear goal towards which we need to work. None of this happens magically. Learners need to be recognized as active agents of change so that they can assume a position in which they can work towards these futures, or a future that is not yet. And that can be hands-on action, but it can also be communicative action. And I would argue that the language classroom is uniquely positioned to contribute to this goal. But it needs to meet a few preconditions for that. And the concept of agency helps us link the language classroom and hope to human rights education. I would argue that human rights-informed language classroom or language education is what is needed to turn philosophies of hope for pedagogy into actual classroom practice. And this is based on the idea that the climate crisis and other sustainability crises at their core are not only cultural crises, as Meyer and Wilson put it, or political crises, as Hayward put it, but also human rights crises. Because worldwide, climate change threatens people's basic capability to support themselves with dignity, as it undercuts the rights to health, to food, to water. It may even affect the right to self-determination. And then Levy and Patz add the rights to freely determine one's political status, to freely pursue economic, social, and cultural development, as well as the right to education itself to the list of potentially infringed human rights. They also stress that there's an imbalance when it comes to those who tend to be affected by climate change and the associated human rights restrictions, to the disadvantage of low-income countries and poorer people within high-income countries. And that is an idea expressed in Rob Nixon's notion of slow violence, to indicate that climate change-related socio-ecological injustices are oftentimes invisible, slow, and gradual, and mostly affect the vulnerable, the poor, the disempowered. It is a widely received notion amongst observers that those who have least contributed to the problem have to bear the direst consequences of climate change. So maybe in educational contexts, we need to expand our focus on human rights of all, to also include human rights duties that come with those rights. And among these duties, according to Knox, are the duty to respect the human rights of others, the duty to protect the human rights of others, as well as the duty to fulfill or facilitate satisfaction of the human rights of others. In other words, action. So on the basis of human rights education. Frauke Matz and I thought of some rather broad classroom principles which could help implement human rights education in language education. For example, learning needs to be relevant to the learner's life worlds, for them to appreciate the significance of human rights in their everyday lives, as well as identify their own role in upholding human rights for others. Because socio-environmental injustices pervade all societies on various levels. And this involves a high degree of self-reflection and an awareness of one's own position and subjectivity in the discourse on human rights and the climate crisis as a human rights issue. To address socio-environmental issues, learners need to develop problem-solving skills, and this could be achieved through meaningful and complex tasks, which involve problem posing and communicative action orientation. In addition, materials and texts should be multimodal and offer multiple perspectives on a given topic so as to avoid myopic, in reality then oftentimes exclusively nationalistic views. And this way, the notion of universal inclusivity within the human rights discourse can be made accessible for learners. In short, education about, for, and through human rights is fundamental to the idea of hopeful language pedagogy. So what could be the role of language education in all of this exactly? To answer that question, I like to turn from slow violence to slow hope. Christoph Mauch says that if we acknowledge that human manipulation of the earth has been a destructive force that has caused huge converging threats, particularly over the last couple of centuries, we can also imagine that human endeavors can help us build a less destructive world in the centuries to come. And that he calls slow hope. And I would argue that the language classroom can become a space of slow hope, because it can provide learners with stories of hope and transformation and help them learn and practice languages of hope, of advocacy, and of peace. Mochizuki and Christodoulou talk about this in their textbooks for sustainable development, which also feature a segment on language education. They say there is a language for peace, and it is one we need to use if we are to bring peace. The language of peace enables us to diffuse situations of violence, deal effectively with conflict, and improve our relationships generally. And in my article, I talk about a few characteristics of languages of hope and advocacy. Much more research needs to be done there. But these ideas of languages of hope and advocacy are inspired by this idea of a language of peace. For instance, we have specific vocabulary, affective and attitudinal competences, components rather, but also much more hard-edged aspects such as high levels of modality, the use of emotive, persuasive language, direct address and personal pronouns, the use of present and future tenses, and so on. But besides a focus on the linguistic components of language learning, we can also focus on stories of hope and transformation, which offer stories revolving around socio-ecological justice, human rights, and more than human rights, and global citizenship to the learners. And we could argue that dystopian texts already kind of invite learners to take a new twist on them and turn them into hopeful visions of the future. But I would argue that the vocabulary and other linguistic features, as well as the unique narrative aspects that make up languages of hope and advocacy, are much rather provided in stories that are inherently hopeful, such as solar punk stories or hope punk, fiction and nonfiction. Solar punk and hope punk are artistic or literary genres, which are also observable in games, if you're interested in game-based learning. And they really lend themselves, I think, as objects of learning in the literary-based, hopeful language classroom. I want to give you an example to illustrate how hopeful pedagogy might be implemented in the classroom. This is the result of theory-practice collaboration, if you will. I worked together with my colleague, Dr. Philipp Siebmann, and with Janine Bruns, who was the one turning these theoretical deliberations into actual classroom practice in two 12th grade groups, English as a foreign language learners. The goal of this lesson unit was to create a student book. Based on Yuval Harari's best-selling book, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, the students were asked over the course of a few weeks to engage with global issues and challenges to do with socio-ecological justice, human rights, and global citizenship. And then, based on that, create their own book called 26 Young People's Ideas for the 21st Century. The cover that you see right now was drawn by a student, Carlotta, and upon first glance is indicative of a deep and multi-layered understanding of sustainability-related issues. And if we look at this excerpt from the book on the right that you see, something the students wrote themselves too, we can see how the learners turned the idea of language pedagogy of hope into practice. Just going to give you a second to read through this. And although they hint at the potentially catastrophic consequences of unsustainable lifestyles here, they also emphasize the idea of slow hope and of human agency through recurring to the SDGs. And this is critical hope. And one might argue that this orientation of pedagogy takes on utopian characteristics here or there, overemphasizing an individual's agency and opportunities to effectuate change. And I think one would be correct in saying that. However, my colleagues and I would argue that also it is absolutely crucial to let that happen in the classroom, because these are the perspectives and constructions of the learners, materializations of their very own engagement with highly complex topics and challenges. This lesson unit was designed to counter prevailing doom and gloom approaches, as well as to focus on the communicative realization of hopeful language pedagogy. And to really marry this with the development of critical and reflexive literacies, those targeted by us in an ideal world, also in human rights education, requires implementation of this type of pedagogy as early as possible to avoid singular engagement in the scope of the odd lesson unit devoted to sustainability issues and human rights. And I'm excited to share with you that I'm also working on providing educators with more ideas to do just that in an upcoming special issue of the teaching practice journal Der Fremdsprachliche Unterricht Englisch here in Germany. It's also going to be in German, co-edited with Carola Surkamp, which is going to be entitled Hope and Advocacy. And that is going to feature 6 lesson designs authored by various actors from school and from practice, which helps educators and learners learn and practice languages of hope and advocacy in the English language classroom. It's going to be published in 2024, so we're working on it right now, but already it's very, very clear to me just how much fun this is for everyone as well, including the various authors. So there is a craving for hopeful pedagogy, and besides everything else, it's fun. So in retrospect, engaging with human rights and human rights education and its potential for informing language education of hope has taught me that hope is not only scientific, it is necessary if we are to face the challenges posed to us in what some have called a polycrisis. And I would argue that human rights-informed language education can make valuable contributions to this, as language and communication are key for negotiating and designing better futures for all. And with that, thank you so much. Dankeschön.
Thank you very, very much, Ricardo. You've presented us with an argument for a pedagogy of hope, for language education, which is dealing directly with hope at a moment in global history when we could easily turn away from hope, or we could be feeling rather pessimistic. So thank you for that inspiration. I wonder if anybody here is ready to pose their questions. If you can put them in the chat, that's excellent, because then we see how many questions we've got coming. But if anybody would like to kick off simply by raising their hand, that would also be excellent. And if I can encourage people who've recently arrived just to show their faces, if they're able to, because I think that gives us a real feel of who's in the meeting, and we feel more part of a community of scholars that way. So are the people here? Yes, Bruno, please.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. First of all, thank you, Ricardo, for this wonderful presentation. Very enlightening. I've been working, I'm a PhD student here in Portugal. And for my PhD project, I decided to research the impact of teaching strategy for teaching English, Portuguese as a host language for immigrants who have moved to Portugal. And this pedagogy that I've been working on is based on intercultural competence, developing intercultural competence throughout the language course. Now, my students, they're basically, I've been testing this pedagogy while I put it together, basically, so that I can develop a manual which will be used in the intervention itself, which should happen next year. God help me. But the thing is, throughout this, my classes, I've been testing it. And yesterday, I told my students that today is a holiday in Brazil, and I've been trying to focus on cultural issues. So I told them that it's a holiday, and the holiday is actually because today is the day that the Republic was proclaimed in Brazil. So I brought up this issue, and I told them that even though it may seem like a very glorious thing, in practice, the idea of implementing the republic in Brazil was caused because the regime the monarchy was no longer sustainable. And so I brought to them the discourse that was behind it. So slavery was no longer viable. So there, the republic was like a good solution for this issue in Brazil. And then I prompted them to think about their countries' histories. They're mostly from South Asia, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and some of them shared their views, and they were ready to identify discords in the story. But they had a very negative perception of human rights because some of them mentioned, well, in my country, for example, I left my country because it's been exploited by so many other countries. And even though we come from rich countries in Africa, some of them mentioned, we live in poverty. And the very countries that actually raised the flag, the human rights flag, are the ones that have power and therefore enforce their wishes upon the other nations. And then I found myself in a a dead end. I was like, yeah, it's true. I mean, how am I going to try to twist this into a nice thing? It's a fact. I mean, but then I said, oh, well, if each of us, if we can do our part and contribute to a better world and blah, 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 then I myself was not convinced that, I can't see a way of, trying to share something positive with them. I felt like I was not really convinced of my own words, even though I knew I had the duty to try to bring something good out of it. So I was hoping, you could share with me some tips, because sometimes by trying to bring these issues to class, I sometimes feel unprepared to deal with these situations. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruno. Ricardo, please.
Thank you.
A big one.
Absolutely. Thank you, Bruno. Right at the heart of the issue. First of all, very much success, as we say in Germany, for your PhD. You'll get there. You raise a lot of important issues there. First of all, the decoloniality aspect and some points of criticism that I've often got because I chose human rights as a value basis. And that's just the choice I made, and I stand by it, but people criticize me for that sometimes. Not because they don't like human rights, but precisely because of the things that you just reported. It's seemingly a Western concept, which I always think is not true, because the Declaration of Human Rights was ratified and signed by all nations, almost all nations, right, in the world, and it's not only a Western product. Although you could use these points of friction, if you will, these moments of friction, with in the sense of the idea of critical hope. We acknowledge the status quo, and we know it's difficult, and we acknowledge that there is ambiguity, there might even be anger, there might even be despair, and that's okay. And I'm not saying look at the climate crisis and just shrug off everything that's going on, it's going to be fine. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that take that status quo as it is and go from there. Acknowledge how bad things are, and acknowledge that there are difficulties within the classroom for you when it comes to, for example, the dealing of human rights and the hypocrisy of some states and organizations to call out other people on human rights. Carol Hahn wrote a very, very nice article about that, emphasizing or surveying how human rights education is dealt with in a few European countries, coming to exactly that point, that it's always outward protruding, right? We always look at what others do wrong rather than turn to ourselves. And take that, and from there develop visions of hope. Like, how could it be better? Just ask your students exactly that. That would be my take. What exactly could be better? And then have them discuss that. And in a language classroom, I think that's enough already to start, because they learn how to speak about these things. They learn how to communicate, to negotiate, and also communicatively to negotiate ambiguity. That would be my answer to that.
Thank you, Ricardo. And I think we have a question from Sue Gollifer, and then one from Kirsty White. Sue, please. It follows on directly, I think.
Yeah, it does. Thanks, Ricardo. Lovely to see you again after Dublin. And it does follow, because I'm also working with English language teachers, and we use stories and narratives and what I refer to as a relational approach to explore these, to better understand the role of human rights. And I'm just wondering to what extent you feel that it's important to address the complexities and the contentions of human rights in your teaching, and what role does knowledge of human rights actually play in your pedagogy?
That's a very good question. Thank you, Sue. Also very nice to see you again. As I just hinted, I think that addressing complexity, the frictions, ambiguity is a very, very important point of this. And we could link this now to pedagogies of discomfort and pedagogies of or education as experience of crisis, because this basically is an experience of crisis, right? If you think about human rights and suddenly some very, very good question makes you question your own mindset, your own worldviews, that is a crisis. But from that can come learning. So as a point of departure, I don't think we can value these complexities and frictions highly enough. They shouldn't be the end point, though, in my opinion. And knowledge of human rights plays a huge role. I briefly mentioned this idea that's very well known to everyone in the human rights discourse of education about, for, and through human rights. And I think none of them works without the other. So we need knowledge about human rights in order to learn and act for them. And as teachers, we need knowledge of human rights or about human rights in order to create with our students the learning environments to learn through human rights, participation, for example, and access to education and access to resources in the classroom. So I think knowing about human rights is extremely important, and also knowing that they are not set in stone. And that goes both ways. They can be expanded, but they can also be negotiated about in terms of what counts as a human right and what doesn't, maybe what will count as a human right in the future, and maybe what will not count as a human right in the future anymore. And there could be danger associated to this, there could be chances associated to this, but it's important to know these things in order to be able to communicate about them.
Thank you, Ricardo. And I would just take the opportunity as chair to add to that, because I've been very privileged over the last couple of weeks, having published a book which is aimed at a broader audience than an academic audience, to have discussions about very real human rights stories that I have researched in a book of my own called Where Are You From? No, Where Are You Really From? And it traces a family's history over 250 years. And what I've discovered and what I think is highlighted in a story like that is that the whole process that we talk about in decolonizing the curriculum and thinking about coloniality and relationships of countries to each other is brought into sharp focus in the lives of individuals. And so my own family, originating in India, but having migrated to different places, have had themselves in different points in their history, in different positions in relation to the colonial power. And I think you can point out complexity in a story like that. And the other thing the story brought out for me, which impressed some of the audience, was that ideas travel and they shift and they change. And so my 3 times great-grandfather traveled from India to London and to France in 1789. And he was taking back ideas to India and transforming them and reworking them in that place. And so that is a very concrete example of how the European Enlightenment and the ideas of human rights were being transported, reinterpreted. And we all know this in terms of people who've worked from difficult situations as enslaved people to fight for abolition of slavery, for example. So when we take history from the bottom upwards, we find very concrete examples of this challenge that Bruno has faced and that you've spoken about, where these ideas are not the preserve of one group, but they are something which can be worked and reworked in different groups. But we have a question also from Kirsty that I'd like to move on to. Thank you, Kirsty.
Thanks, Audrey. So this is to you, Ricardo. I was listening to what Bruno was saying about his students and thinking about how you can actually support students to change their perspective, to go from that sort of slow violence that you were talking about into the slow hope. So as a classroom practitioner, I have students who, you help them to develop their agency, then they'll go home and actually their parents will kind of undo the work that you've done in a way, and it takes an awful lot to kind of go backwards and forwards with building that confidence in the young people to actually feel hopeful about something, where the experience of their parents might actually kind of counteract that narrative that you're building in the classroom. So as an educator, where do we bring this in? Where do we start with young children, and how do we bring their wider community in with the narrative as well? Because I think that's a difficult thing. Is you say one thing in the class and then outside in the wider community, that dissolves. So what can we do to actually kind of strengthen those links and support students to develop their agency in the classroom that actually takes them out into the community and builds that?
Thank you, Chrissy. Very good question. I have a couple of answers to that. They are linked to a seminar of mine that I'm giving right now at university to my students, who are all going to be future teachers of English in German secondary schools. And that seminar, unsurprisingly, is called Looking at the Bright Side, Hopeful Pedagogies in the Language Classroom. And that question came up in the very first session when we talked about optimism, pessimism, and hope. And where's the difference between optimism and hope? What kind of optimism are we talking about? What kind of hope are we talking about? One thing that I would note before I address this issue of how can we connect it to the outside communities is this idea that you expressed in the question you wrote down, whether age affects pessimism and students become stronger and as they get, or that pessimism becomes stronger as they grow older. I'm not sure if that's the case really, because what I see when I look at the youngest or the younger generations right now is just fear and despair. I don't see a lot of hope. I see Fridays for Futures movements and Extinction Rebellion and Last Generation in Germany, Letzte Generation. And we see protests and we see students walking out of schools because that's their last resort and they don't have anything else to lose, basically, because they see their futures in shambles. So if pessimism becomes even stronger, I'm not sure if it's even like it's on a very, very high level, I feel generally. But pessimism is part of critical hope. It's where it starts, right? I mentioned Corinne Pellichon's book. Actually, I actually just got the copy today. And just one glance at it showed me that she looks at hope not so much as a mindset, but as a skill. And she distinguishes that from optimism, which is, or from espoir. She distinguishes espérance in French, hope, and espoir, also kind of hope. But espoir is a feeling, and hope, espérance, is a skill, a competence to see where things might change, where things might be headed in a better way based on where we are right now. Disappointed hope, critical hope, if you will. And I think that's what we can teach our students as well, what we can help them explore, to see the bad right now and then to move on towards visions of hope. And I think that's why the language classroom is so uniquely positioned, because we can actually deal with stories of hope that are utopian and that are idealistic, of course, but we can extrapolate from that visions of hope for our own little futures in our own spheres, from the self to the local to the family, but also to the regional, the national, the global. And that's where my global citizenship background comes in, right? And speaking of that, of which, how to bring it outside of the classroom. I think that hopeful pedagogies linked with this idea of critical hope and critical pedagogies lend themselves to opening the classroom and to have your students explore hope in their everyday lives. So one of the activities that I always do with my students is called Hopeful Spaces in Local Places, where I ask them to go out with a partner or anyone really to look for places that they associate with hope and to think about and reflect why they associate this place with hope, and then talk to their partners about it and see if it's relatable to them. And they will see that the very fabric of what makes a hopeful space or hopeful place are shared with other people around them. And I think maybe through that sense of community, that can strengthen a sense of hope in the sense of a skill to look for hope, to look for alternative ways in which the future can go.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Ricardo. We have another question. I'm not sure who it's from, but the question is, what strategies do you have for language learners to engage with human rights instruments? It comes from Hugh.
Yeah, that was my question. So thank you very much. I love that activity about going out and finding spaces of hope. One can also go out and find spaces that are associated with different human rights, of course, and that's one of the activities I do. But whilst you've got students clearly discussing these very high-level issues and emotionally charged issues. As you also said, they need some knowledge about what exactly is a human right. And we've got all these instruments, the Universal Declaration, the European Convention and so on, which can appear quite dry and maybe alien to young people. And I wonder if you have experience of your students actually engaging with those instruments and how you went about doing that.
Thank you. My own experience is somewhat limited, as within the frame of your question, to the SDGs, which also I would argue are inherently human rights related, especially SDG 4.7, where I asked students, Chinese students actually, who were on an exchange. I did that together with Nitasyet Iftikhar. He's a eco-pedagogue, and he invited me to Berlin, to Bard College, to lead this workshop with Chinese exchange students. And what we did there was aimed at education for sustainable development. So we looked at the 17 SDGs that there are, and then we asked the students to identify things missing in those 17 SDGs, or create an 18th SDG. Come up with something that was important to them, but they felt missing. And they do come up with very, very good ideas. And then got talking about what would a better SDG, or what would a better Agenda 2050 maybe look like? What would an SDG 18 look like? So I used these instruments, UNESCO's SDG and UNESCO's Education for Sustainable Development Agenda. And my colleague, as you know, Frauke Matz, she works very extensively with children's rights and the Children's Rights Convention, which is much closer to home for children as compared to the Human Rights Declaration. And she works with, for example, we use those multimodal texts. There are a lot of very short videos, especially from our focus right now in Northern Westphalia, the state in Germany where I am, in the Abitur, which is the A-levels exam equivalent, is on Nigeria or West Africa. So we look at texts from there and about Nigeria, and there are some videos about water hawker boys who need to transport water to people who can then buy that water for refreshment. But these water hawker boys do not have access to the water that they're actually carrying, because it's too expensive for them. And that lends itself as an introduction to the discussion of water as a human right, or access to water as a human right, as a children's right, and helps them to reflect on their own use of water on a daily basis by means of a water diary, for example. And through things like these that are very low threshold, you can start a conversation about human rights and children's rights, always starting with the self and their own experiences. And I think then it's not too inaccessible for them.
Thank you, Ricardo. Do we have other questions? Melina, I don't want
I have.
Sorry, who has? Right, Christy has a question. And before I take Christy's question, I know that Ricardo was particularly delighted that Melina was able to make it this evening. So Melina, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you have anything to say or to comment, I know Ricardo will value that. But we'll take Christy's question while you're reflecting.
Oh, I was going to offer up, Melina, if you would like to go, if you feel first. That's no, okay.
Christy, please go ahead.
Okay, so sorry. Ricardo, thank you. This is just, I'm hopeful. I'm excited to have listened to you and to do a lot more reading of your work. And I personally, on the water walk, I was challenged by, or not challenged, but one of my my advisor for my PhD actually had us go out and look, find a place or a water or land and write about it, through, and I took the human rights perspective and also used language of the Wakpatanka, which is the Mississippi River here where I am, but with Dakota language and our indigenous languages. But so I guess my connected question is linked to some of what you've talked about regarding land and water. I have, and I'm happy to say I even have a hard copy now of my recent dissertation that was on stories as theory, or is on stories as theories, illuminating human rights education through the narratives of human rights educators. So I'm interested on your stories as theories, because I was also asked, well, wait, are stories theories or are they methodologies? And thinking about that, yeah, how we kind of see our own narratives as evolving as well, and whether or not you've done any thought and work on that. Thanks.
It's a very interesting one. Also, first of all, congrats. It must have been a very, very nice feeling. And also, I'm happy for everyone to be here. I just want to put that out there. Yeah, a little bit. Maybe we have to continue this conversation because I think I need to think about this a little more, but from the top of my head, I work a lot in multiliteracies pedagogy as well. And one of those things that Kalantzis and Cook, among others, distinguish are 4 knowledge processes that historically have shaped and influenced learning and education. And one of them is conceptualizing. And they talk about conceptualizing as naming and conceptualizing as theorizing. And the minute you name something, you start theorizing about it. So you can think of stories against this background as theories, as ever-evolving theories of what the world is, as a description of the world, so to say, be it fiction or non-fiction or faction, whatever you have. So yeah, that would be my very first angle, but I'd be very happy to continue that discussion.
Thank you. And I think, Melina, if you want to say anything, it will be the last word, because we are running out of time. If you have a brief comment or reflection.
Yeah. Thank you, Audrey. It's very nice to be here. Thank you, Ricardo, for your wonderful presentation. And it's been really nice to see all of you today. I think this is a very complex theme, and something that makes me something that is relieving is to think that, maybe for me at least, is to think that not all language classrooms should have this goal. There are language classrooms that have other goals that we, particularly we as this group, can consider instrumental, well, this is something we have to acknowledge as well. And in terms of how we can connect what happens in the classroom, in the language classroom, with the community, I love your ideas. They are wonderful. What I've also done is not only to maybe identify and name spaces of hope and describe them through stories and narratives. Sometimes what I've found interesting or motivating for the students to do is to actually engage in community action in the local community. This has its risks, so for instance, if this narrative that I saw that you showed, the students write the narratives and then they can do something else with their narratives and stories, apart from creating the book. Well, what could they do with the book? Maybe organize a campaign about a particular topic, or if we are thinking about the environment, take some action in the community. It can be an action that students go around and actually perform somewhere, or it can be done on social media. So there are really many things that we are all doing. And I would be interested in learning more about everything, really.
Thank you very much, Melina. I think
Thank
I have
you.
to give you the last word because we're now at 5:30 local time for me, and we said we would conclude within 1 hour. But I wish to end on that note. Melina has advocated action. It's never the most straightforward solution to education, particularly with the younger learners, but it is to me, a positive and a natural next step, even if it poses some challenges with younger learners. I would just like to thank all of you for attending. I would like to say to you as language educators that you are most welcome to our next seminar, which will be on the 17th of January, when Piers, who's actually here tonight, is going to be drawing on his recent article from Human Rights Education Review. I encourage all of you to consider thinking about these ideas further and writing for us and reflecting on that. We really welcome the contributions of language educators. They are not restricted to the special edition, which Melina and Tony are going to currently guest editing for us. But they are, language education does provide a really special space in which human rights education can take place. And I hope that you will share ideas and share your research with the human rights community. And those of you who are citizenship educators and social studies educators who've come along this evening, I hope that the language classroom has opened up new thoughts for you as well. So thank you everyone for coming, and please remember our next seminar, and also remember that you are most welcome in London on the 19th of April, when we will be having our international conference. We're already receiving papers from far and wide, from Japan, from the US, from across Europe and other places. And we hope to see many of you there. And thanks again for being part of this. This will be on YouTube, and you'll be able to see this seminar and listen carefully. It was a very rich contribution, Ricardo. You gave us many things. You've extended my reading list hugely. And I'm very grateful for that. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.